Okay, I'm speaking today with Mr. Paul Macht, and it's June 26th, 1985. And Mr. Macht, maybe you can tell me about where your parents first came from before they came to North Battleford.
Yes, my parents farmed on the Volga River in Russia. They immigrated there years before. I understand that it was a German colony went to Russia to do farming. And my dad was farming there. His name was Jacob, and my mother was Magdalena. And my uncle Adam, my dad's brother, he was farming there also. So both decided in 1912, there was rumors of war and things like that. And I imagine there must have been somebody over there that was boosting North Battleford, or Battleford at the time, because they bought their tickets when they did, right to Battleford. So in 1912, they had a good crop. They decided they were going to immigrate to Canada. So after they got their crop off in the fall, they had to sold all their belongings, the farm, I guess. In a way, they decided to leave. It was late in the fall when they did leave. And of course, in them days, there was no highways. They had to go quite a few miles to the railroad station. The two families, there was the two families took the journey. They were all in a covered wagon, and a team of horses pulling it, and it started to rain. And the rain made the road muddier and muddier, and the mud was sticking to the wheels. The horse could hardly pull it. So at one time, it got so bad the horse could hardly pull the wagon, and the driver was going to turn around and go back. My dad, being the older of the two, he decided, no, we'll keep it going till we get to the railroad station. So they did. They kept it going, and they finally made it.
Where was the railroad station?
I think it was in the town of Saratov. I'm not just sure. And they boarded the train there and went across Russia and into Germany and onto the west coast port of Hamburg, I believe. And when they got there, one of the girls from the other family got the measles. So they were quarantined, so they had to stay there. And our family was able to carry on. So they went with a small boat over to Liverpool and boarded an ocean liner. 1912, there weren't the ocean liners that they have now, but it was a fairly big one. I don't recall the name of it. And they went across the ocean. Everybody got sick, seasick, except me, I guess. And we, after a pretty rough voyage, we got to Halifax. I don't know, it must have taken about 8 or 9 days, I think, on the ocean. So when we got to Halifax, one of my sisters got the measles. So we were delayed. We were quarantined for 2 weeks. After the 2 weeks were over, they were allowed to carry on. So they carried on by railroad train. I don't know just what route they took, but they went through the eastern Canada and through Winnipeg, I suppose, and they were, of course, going to Battleford. So they got to the town of Humboldt, where the train stopped for some hours, and they got off the train. On their return they went to the railroad station. Here, the other family that they had left over in Germany, where they were separated, they come together. The kids just all embraced themselves. They were so happy to meet each other. So they got on the train together in Humboldt and come to North Battleford on January the 6th, 1913.
How old were you at this time?
Well, at that time, I was just born the previous June, so I was only 6 months old or so.
And so they left Humboldt?
Yes, they left Humboldt together. Yes, after being separated, they didn't see each other. So the other family come across the ocean by themselves, and our family as well. It is quite an experience. It's quite a story. Of course, I don't remember anything of that, but that's what I was told, that they were separated in Hamburg and come across the ocean separately, and then they met again in Humboldt, from Hamburg to Humboldt. What an experience.
And how did they get to North Battleford?
Well, they went from Humboldt to North Battleford by train. They landed here, and I guess in them days they used to have an immigration hall. They were in the immigration hall a few days. And they couldn't speak a word of English, of course, in them days, just German. Of course, my dad and my uncle, they were conscripted in the Russian army, And my dad, he was a valet for one of the Russian officers, and he learned to speak the Russian language. And my uncle he was conscripted in the army too, when they were about 21, and he learned Russian too. So both my dad and my uncle were bilingual in German and Russian.
So did your father ever take up a homestead here?
Oh, that's what I often wonder. What would have happened if my dad would have went on a farm? No, he didn't take up a homestead. Of course, in them days, you could get a homestead for $10, And things were booming in North Battleford. My uncle and my dad got a job in working for the city at 25 cents an hour. In them days, they used to work 10 hours a day, $2.50 a day. What an experience. They thought that was a lot of money. Maybe it was, but they never did go on a farm. But our family had 2 boys and a girl. They could have helped on the farm. No, 2 boys and 3 girls. They could have helped on the farm. Of course, they were all small. But anyway, the other family had about 5 or 6 children too.
This was your father's brother?
My father's brother, yeah. So they were, see, my father and my uncle, they were brothers, and my mother and my aunt were sisters. So these 2 families were just as close as you could have 2 families. They were, all the children were first cousins.
And what type of work did your father and uncle do in town?
Well, I think my first dad's first job was working on the roof of the International Harvester building. They were just finishing that building that winter. You know, the roof. They had built the building complete except the roof, and I think that was my dad's first job, as far as I remember. Then he started to work for the city when that job was over, digging ditches for her. In them days, they never had no machines. They dug all these ditches. This contractor from Alberta, he had the contract to build these water and sewer lines in the city, and that's how they used to dig them in them days. By hand, shovel. Pick and shovel, eh? So Dad got a city with that contractor, and for 25 cents an hour, working 10 hours a day.
And whereabouts did you live in town? Did you take
Oh,
a
yes.
home?
That's quite interesting. My uncle and my dad, they built a house on the CPR lots, which is just east of the city. In fact, the ring road that we have around the city at the present time just goes by that lot there, where we used to live there. It's approximately the 1100 block, straight east of the city. They used to call them CPR lots. I don't know how long they were CPR lots. I don't think they're called that anymore. The city took over all them lots sometime between 1913 and the present time.
Did a lot of people live on these CPR lots?
Yes, there must have been about 10 or 12 families living in the CPR lots in them days.
And where was your school?
Oh, yes. Well, they started school at Notre Dame. We were Catholic, of course. So I don't remember the exact year. I imagine it was about 1919, somewhere around there. And I remember the first year I went to school. See, the school was, Notre Dame School was built in 1912, according to the sign in the center of the school, outside the building. Notre Dame Catholic School, number 16, 1912. It was a brick building, about 90 feet long and about 35 or 40 feet wide. It was built only for 2 classrooms on the main floor, and a wide hallway and a stairway going up to the second floor. And they used to have mass up there in the second floor on Sundays, you know. I recall going to mass there. And they discontinued having mass there in the later years. We used to have mass in the building just opposite the old post office on King Street.
I see.
For a few years. I recall that real well when we used to go down there. I remember when the sisters took over at the separate school, 1925. Previous to 1925, we had lay teachers, Miss McKinley. She was principal. Miss Richard, Miss Antoinette Roy. We had 3 teachers in them early days, early 20s. Then when the sisters come into town in 1925, they took over the Notre Dame School. Sister Birchman's was the principal. And there was 3 other teachers, and they were building the Notre Dame Church in 1925. That is when the sisters come into town. And the sisters started to teach in September 1925. Of course, they were building the church. My dad was he was working on the construction of the church there too. He had got a job there working for the contractor.
In those days, was there a lot of different kinds of students, different nationalities of kids going to that Notre Dame school?
Oh yes. Yes, there were different nationalities, but there weren't so many children going to that school in them days. They only had 2 main classrooms. They had about 25 or 30 desks in each room there, so they only had. Well, I believe there were about 90 children, and they had a classroom downstairs in the girls' basement. They had a temporary wall put up there, and had about 25 or 30 desks in there. That's where I was in grade 1 or beginner. I was downstairs, you know.
Any people that were your schoolmates back then still around North Battleford? Can you give us a few names?
There's not very many around North Battleford. No, they're scattered all over Canada. I'd like to get a hold of one of them registers saying, or a few school registers from the early 20s, and just look at all the names. There's a few of the girls around. Vivian Nolan, she's around. There are several that didn't begin school in Notre Dame, in North Battleford, but there was a few around that went to school in their, say, grade 5, 6, 7, and 8. We had grades 1 to 8 in them days. And there's a few people around that went to school, say, 3 or 4 years. Another one that I recall is Helen Shrimmel. She was, her maiden name was Helen Murphy. Good Irish name. Anyway, she went to school and at Notre Dame. Jim Maher went to school at Notre Dame. He's still around. Oh, I guess there's a few around. I don't recall any right now.
And you first lived out at the CPR lots.
Yeah.
Did you ever move from there into a different
Oh,
location?
yeah. We lived out there. My dad and my uncle, I believe I mentioned, they built a house. They didn't want to. Rent was out of the question for them, paying rent, you know. So they built a house up in the CPR lots. I think they built it between themselves. I was just a baby. I don't recall that. But they built one house, and then they built another one. They built another one after they got one finished, they built another one so each family had their own house. And my dad, by 1920, I think it was, he saved a few dollars by then, and he went to the Security Lumber Company, and he found out that they had a house there right behind the hospital on 1042 James, it used to call it. And it was a nice big house with people living in it, and wanted to know if they'd wanted to sell it. Oh, I think they wanted about $2,500 or $3,000 for it. Dad says, I'll give you $1,200 cash. Well, the manager says, I'll have to write to headquarters and see about that. A couple of weeks later, Dad went in there and he says, you can have the house for $1,200 cash. So we moved it, bought that house in 1042 James, which is right behind the hospital. It was
That would be 108th Street today.
108th Street today, but 107th Street, where the hospital was, that was the last street that had water and sewer. So we never had no water and sewer in that house. But it was a big house. It had 4 bedrooms upstairs and a little room for a bathroom, but there was no bath in it. So we had lots of bedrooms, and there was 1 bedroom downstairs. So we had 5 bedrooms. Dad used to buy about 7 or 8 tons of coal every winter to keep the place warm. Of course, he never had a very big coal bin, so he dug the basement out a bit. It wasn't a full basement. He dug the basement out, and he put a great big tank in there, and he left enough room there that would hold about 7 or 8 tons of coal, and he used to buy that during the summer. In August, $7 or $8 a ton. You couldn't. I don't know what coal is now, but
it was cheap.
Coal now, I guess, would be about $70 or $80 a ton. But anyway, we used to buy the water from the city. We had a pump in the kitchen, and a sink and a pump. We used to pump the water up from this big tank. It used to have the water, the eastern and then all the houses off the water line used to buy the water from the waterman, they used to call him. He had a tank and a team of horses, and it was a steel tank, and they used to fill up your tank and take the water to all these homes that didn't have the water and sewer. And this tank in our basement was big enough to hold two tanks of these watermen's tanks. So it was quite a big tank.
Do you remember who the waterman was?
Oh, Charlie Landweber was a waterman for years and years. Oh yeah, and in the summertime it wasn't a bad job, but in the wintertime he used to have a little apparatus on the valve at the back of the tank where he could put coal in there, and to keep that valve from freezing up, and he'd have to keep that heated all the time during the winter time, especially when it's 40 below, so he could open and close that valve. When he used to carry the water in with 2 pails, And all the houses in them days they didn't have a tank like we did in the basement. They'd have a little tank about a 30 pail tank in the kitchen, you know. And he'd fill these, make about 15 trips. And you know what he used to get for them 30 pails of water? 2 bits.
And what other kind of services did they have in those days? Was there sidewalks at all?
Oh, I'll never forget. When we first moved into town on 1100 block Jane Street, on the east side of the street, there was a wooden sidewalk. And it was pretty low there. And the spring water, the runoff, they never had storm sewers in them days. The water used to run in the low places, and right along the sidewalk was what we used to call the slough. There must have been about 3 feet of water in there. We used to lay on the sidewalk when we were kids, watching these tadpoles swim around this slough. And the sun was shining. It was just great to watch it swim around that water in there.
So, suppose you had some good times growing up. So when did you finally get your first job, and what type of thing did you do?
Well, my dad had after he moved into town, we had a cow, you know. They didn't think of buying milk in them days, you know. And there was quite a few cows around town. In fact, we used to have a herd boy in the summertime. We used to call him a herd boy. He used to come around every morning and start on one end of the town, and if your cow was already milked and ready to go out to pasture, he'd pick up this cow and keep going down the lane. And we had a couple of them days and pick up ours. And then by the time he'd be through, all these homes in the eastern part of town, they'd all have a cow just about. He used to have about 30 cows. And he'd take them out in the grass prairie there. There was a prairie all over the place. And he used to herd them out there in the prairie. And there used to be sloughs all around there. There was lots of water for the cattle. And he'd keep them out there all day. They'd graze on the grass and drink the slough water. In the evening, he'd bring them in to have them milked again. And we'd keep them tethered around the lots there. In them days, there were lots of empty lots, you know. And we'd have it there for the evening, long evenings. And next day, they'd pick them up again in the morning. Oh, there's so much.
Did you ever do any of this type of work yourself, herding cattle?
Oh, I'd heard our own bunch. Just out in the small holdings, you call them now, out there. It used to be all prairie. And we had 6 or 7 milk cows at one time, and I used to herd them around there. We used to bring them out in the spring and herd them around the place. And later on, we rented this place on the city owned this corner on the northeast end of town. There's a half a section of land there that runs from the ring road right out a mile straight east on the Waring Road there, on the north side of the Waring Road there. That's a half a second land that's owned by the city, still owned there. Yeah, it used to be our cow pasture. Used to, in the later years, used to take them out there in the morning and bring them back at night. After I don't recall just how long this herd. See, as time went on, there was less cows around town, and we never had no herd boy. It wasn't worth his while. If he had only 5 or 10 cows, it wasn't worth his while. He used to charge us $1 a month a cow.
So that was cheap.
So he did, yeah.
Most people in North Battleford had cattle and other kinds of animals, or what do you think?
No, I wouldn't say most people had cattle, but a lot of them did. We had a couple of dairymen in town, but one was on Macht, he was on the northwest end of town. We had Davies on the way out in the country about 2 or 3 miles. He had a dairy farm, and Philip Closter, he used to live out in the CPR lots. He had about a dozen milk cows, and he used to sell the milk, his milk from his dairy, to the Savoy Cafe restaurant and the Notre Dame Hospital. Them were his 2 customers. He never used to deliver it to the home, just to the Savoy Cafe and Notre Dame Hospital. Them were his 2 customers, and they kept him going up to 1926, when he passed away, and that was the end of the Phil Closter's dairy. But Macht carried on, and we carried on, and there was, in the 30s, there were about 3 or 4 dairies around town, and we never had no land. We used to buy our hay at the end of July, during fair time, and the first week of August. There was an odd Indian used to come in with some prairie wool, and farmers around the area used to come quite a distance, up to 20 and 25 miles. They used to bring in a load of hay. They'd get about $5 a load.
Describe this prairie wool.
This prairie wool was, in them days, there was a lot of prairie around. You don't see it too often nowadays. And it was prairie wool that would grow about a foot high, you know. In them days, we had a lot more rain than we do now. And with rain, that prairie grass just grows tall, about a foot tall. And after it got a foot tall, it was ready to cut. You used to take one of these mowers with a team of horses, with a sickle on it, you know, and they'd cut it quite a piece. And then they'd have one of these big rakes, and they'd rake it on piles like, and then they'd come along with a hay rack, and they could load it onto the hay rack. And it was just a beautiful aroma, this hay, after they let it sit there for a few days and let it kind of, I can't think the word. But anyway, just a beautiful aroma, this prairie wool. We bought mostly prairie wool for our cattle. There was an odd load of slough hay would come in once in a while. This slough hay would be hay that would grow about 2 feet long, 2 feet high, and it was from a dried out slough, you know, in the 30s, especially in the 30s, say from 29 to about 36 or 37. A lot of these sloughs dried out, you know, it's the dry years. And they'd go and mow that grass. See, that grass would grow in them dried out sloughs. Just grow like anything, and be about 2 feet high, and they'd cut that and with a mower and rake it up with a rake and come along with a hay rack. And cows didn't care too much for the slough grass, but that prairie wool, they just enjoyed it.
Maybe we'll get into another topic now. You can tell us about your first real employment experience in North Battleford, what you did as a mature man.
Well, my wife's brother, Joe Longhammer, he was a tradesman. He was a bricklayer, stonemason, and a stuccoer, and a plasterer. He was a jack of all trades. He learned all these 4 trades over in Germany. He took an apprentice for it, and he really learned the trade properly. I think you know that anybody that learns the trade over there in Europe, they learn the trade properly. He was a good stonemason. He used to go out in the fields and pick out stone. There were stones, you know, all over the place from the farms. And he'd have a big stone hammer on the bottom. And he'd break these stones in half and cut them the way he wanted, build fireplaces out of them.
So you started working with him then?
I started working with him, yeah. He was bricklaying them days. That was in the early 30s. Things were getting tough around, you know. There was no crops, but there was always some work. Joe always was busy especially during the summertime. Joe Longhammer was always doing something. He was doing a lot of stucco work in them days. You know, people would stucco the exterior of their home or whatever it was. And I used to help mix the mud with them. Then for the plastering too. Used to be a plasterer, and that was quite a job, a lot of hard work. I used to mix the mud with that and carry it to them, and I'd have to climb up the ladder, and he usually had a platform and a mud board. I'd mix the mud and put it in a pail, carry 2 pails, and put it on the mud board. And he'd take it off the board with his tools and put on the stucco or plaster. It was quite a job. It was a lot of hard work.
Did he work on any major buildings in the city?
Oh yeah, he built the old city hall. He built he built so many buildings. He also built that corner where Conker's is in at the present time, and I believe he built Kresge's. And there's so many. He built He built this college, the St. Thomas College main building, and he built the school over there. Oh, he built this building. He did quite a bit of work out in the country too. He built a church at Wilkie, and he built buildings all over the place.
So how long did you work with Mr. Longhammer?
I worked with Mr. Longhammer about 7 or 8 years, I think. Yeah. And in 1938, I got this job at the Notre Dame School as caretaker in March. So I took it. There was a job opening, and it was a steady job, $75 a month all year round. In the winter time, there wasn't too much to do as far as the construction work, just an odd job. And in them days, they never used to close up the buildings and work on them during the winter months. It cost too much.
So this job was a lot more secure. And
Yeah. This job at the Notre Dame School was more secure. So I got started in March there in 1938, and I worked there till 1951. Quite a stretch, about 13 years. A good experience. I liked working there. I was a caretaker there, but I didn't stop at that. I was caretaker at the school. I was caretaker for the church. And I used to start the fires over at the rectory in the morning too. They had a hot water system there. And they had a steam boiler in the school and a steam boiler in the church. And during the 40s, I even went over to the convent and got their boilers going. I used to get up about 4:30 in the morning when it was 40 below out in the winter. I get each of these fires and these boilers going. I'd go from one to the other. The school and the convent and the church were all close together, good thing. To go from one to the other. Coal wasn't the only thing I shoveled in them days. I used to shovel snow. In them days they never had no snow blowers like they do. I used to keep the snow off the sidewalk from the rectory corner all along the avenue to York Street or 104th, and all the way down to the school.
So there's quite a bit of work involved there.
Oh, yeah.
What was it like in the 30s, North Battleford, Depression years? Did it hit North Battleford pretty hard that you could tell? Any memorable stories that you have about the Depression?
Well, we used to have our dairy barn and lot right on the corner of 11th Avenue and 111th Street. That was the outskirts of the town in them days. One year we had 2 stacks of hay there. Well, they must have been about 50. One was about 50 feet long and about as high as this room. Yeah. With three loads of hay for each cow, so we had about 7. We had a pony too, so we'd have to have about 24 tons of hay. That's quite a lot of hay, 24 tons of hay for the winter. We'd keep our cattle out in the pasture till the first heavy frost comes, in the fall. Then we'd have to bring, the grass would freeze up, and then we'd have to start keeping them at home, keeping the barn. had a well there close by, lots of water, only about 12, 14 feet deep. We used to pull the water up with a pulley and have a tank there. We had a tank there, cut in half, a big tank, horizontal, and just to water the cows. You'd have to water them twice a day, at least.
So any problems with feed during the Depression?
Well, we never experienced any up to 1937, but we sold out that year. We sold our dairy farm to the Battlefords United Dairies. Was formed in them days, and they operated in town here. They started to pasteurize the milk. I think it was thought that in them days pasteurized milk would be better for people. So they made an order from Regina, I believe, that all milk consumed in the cities would have to be pasteurized. So they formed this North Battleford, the Battlefords Dairy, they used to call it.
Where was it located?
It was on 104th Street and Railroad Avenue, right near the flour mill there. In fact, when the flour mill closed up, that used to be a bake shop. And Battlefords United Dairies bought that building and made a dairy pool. They used to call it the dairy pool. They pasteurized the milk. All these farmers brought the milk in, raw milk in, and they pasteurized it. And then they had a couple of trucks there to deliver it. In them days, they used to have the co-op dairies too. They used to deliver milk. So we had the two dairies in them days, co-op and the Battlefords United Dairies.
And this flour mill that you mentioned, what was it called?
Oh yes, that was quite interesting. Too bad, that Saskatchewan in them days, I think, had quite a few flour mills, and North Battleford was one of them. It used to be called the Union Supply Company Limited. Mr. Klein, he was a mayor of the city of North Battleford at one time. He was the manager of this flour mill. The farmers used to bring their grain in, and they could get their grain made into flour. Used to call it rival flour. We used to go in there and watch them bag this flour. They'd put this 100-pound bag of flour under a little chute and they'd pull a lever, and this flour would come right and fill that bag right up. And they used to have a long needle with a long cord on it, and just made two ears. They fold the bag over and have two ears on the flour bag, and used to start on one side and twist it around, and then put this needle through and sew up the flour bag, and put it around the other ear on the other side, and that's how they used to fasten the flour bag.
And this was the only flour mill in town, or was there?
It was the only one in North Battleford, but there was also one in Battleford.
Oh, I see.
It was called the Bishop Milling Company. And the flour used to be called Sunrise Flour. Mr. Bishop owned that building, and he had that building, or he had that flour mill going for quite a few years after the Battleford's Union Supply Company. I don't remember just how long it lasted, but pretty well in the 30s. I remember the last manager was Mr. Kellerman. When they closed it up, he moved to Meadow Lake from North Battleford. And John Schwimler, he was a neighbor of ours. He worked in the Battleford's Union Supply Company for quite a few years. He was a miller there, you know. And he had 3 or 4 boys in his family, and when we were kids, we used to go down the flour mill on Saturday morning. And they had a big, well, the east end of the mill was a great big room with, they had a bunch of bran in there, sacks of bran. The sacks were brown, and they didn't weigh so much because bran is not heavy. But I don't recall just how heavy they were, but we used to buy that bran for our cows. We used to give them a little feed of bran in a pail, put a little salt with it. Sometimes we put a little water with it and mix it up. While we were milking them, the cows just loved that. Used to buy this bran for $1 a sack in them days. A whole sack for $1. That was the byproduct of the flour, you see. And then days, everything was reasonable.
Any other industries in the town? Like there was the Sterling Millwork. Did you ever happen to come across that place?
Oh yes, Sterling Millwork was quite a place. Too bad it had to burn down here about 3 years ago. They had a wholesale hardware business. Then they had a Sterling millwork business. They used to make doors, window frames, screen doors. They could make anything. They made the communion rail of the Notre Dame church when it was built in 1925. Nice, beautiful arches in the railing. Just beautiful. They could make anything. They had the equipment. All the lumber they used was dry lumber, kiln dried. They used to have a kiln there. They used to dry it themselves, and they used to have a storage there. They'd buy the lumber way ahead of time and store it for quite a few months before they'd ever use it. And it was quite a business. It was a going concern until these deutertherm windows come into being, and gradually the business just slowed down. But we used to get an odd window, glass put in the window. I'd go down there and watch them. Just give one stroke with a putty. And he'd have the one side of the window pane done. He used to have a little machine he'd put before he'd put the putty on. He'd put in little triangle, little metal plates there to hold the glass in place. I used to get a kick out of watching these fellas put a sheet of glass in the frame. Just marvelous how they could just give one stroke and put that putty on one side and one stroke on the other, and in about 30 seconds they'd have a window done with the putty.
Do you remember the old powerhouse in North Battleford?
Oh yes, that was a marvel. I used to I used to enjoy taking lunch to, my uncle worked there. And
What
Nick,
was his name?
Adam. My uncle's name was Adam Macht. And he used to fire the boilers there. And they used to keep about 200 pounds of pressure on the boilers, you know. And to get all this slack coal in there. And I'm telling you, these guys, they were working in heat all the time. They were sweating. It was no joke to do firing them boilers. They used to fire 8 hours a day, 8 hours a day, I think. That's about all they could stand. And Uncle would have different shifts, you know, in them days. Sometimes we'd bring him on Saturday morning. We'd bring him his lunch. Other days he'd take his lunch along, and we used to go down and with one or two of his boys and bring him this lunch. We used to go into the roundhouse and go along there, great big wheels turning, and it's just a marvel to see. And then we'd go over to the boiler room there, and give him his lunch, and he'd be there with his overalls on and sweating away. A pretty hot job, especially in the summertime. I guess in the wintertime it wasn't so bad, but in the summer. They used to have a cooling system on the east side of the powerhouse. And they had these pipes with special sprays on them. And it used to just spray the water right up. And it was just a beautiful sight. I wish I had a picture of this spray when it was in operation. Just a beautiful sight.
Do you remember where the powerhouse was located?
Oh yeah, it was just located just approximately straight west of the subway. It was on the south side of the railroad track. You used to have a spur from there's two main lines coming in from the west end over the subway. And you used to have a spur going into the powerhouse to unload their coal. You got most of the coal in by railroad track, by car, coal car. And you'd have this, you'd run it off the main line and just run it along this spur there, right alongside the railroad track. The powerhouse was south side of the railroad track. Oh, the city owned it. The city owned the powerhouse. And the city run it. It was built in 1912, I believe. They had them were the boom years, 1912, they built the powerhouse. They built the Notre Dame School. They built the Connaught School. And the old collegiate school was built in 1911, the year before. And in 1913, the hospital was built. So between 1912 and 1913, all these buildings, brick buildings, were built. That was the boom. Them were the boom days of North Battleford.
We'll just switch topics here again, and you can tell us about I guess it would be your third occupation, working for the CNR Railway.
Oh, yes. In 1951, the Canadian National Railroad, right across Canada, went on a 40-hour week. Thereby, they required more staff or more workers, That was right across Canada. So I had little experience with steam boilers. I applied for the job. I was only about 41, I think. And I was accepted. So June the 30th, 1951, was my last day at the Notre Dame School. And I started to work on July the 1st on the railway. Seeing at the powerhouse, at the roundhouse, I mean. No, the roundhouse, yeah. That was quite a switch. You see, they went on a 40-hour week and they were paying, I forget now, so much an hour. And for all the scheduled holidays, and for every hour you worked overtime, you got paid for it, time and a half, which was a better opportunity, made a little more money. But the only drawback was I used to have to work midnight most of the time. During the summer months, I used to, when I started there, I was on the midnight shift. I used to wipe these engines, these 5,000s that used to come from Regina in with the passenger train. They used to stop them here and bring them in the roundhouse. I used to wipe them engines. They had a rail liner. They used to call it the skunk. They used to run it up the Medstead and all these north lines there, and they run that 2 or 3 times a week, and they run that in the roundhouse too. And every time that would come in, they'd have oil spilled all over the floor there, and I don't know, there was something leaking there, leaking oil, but then they used to take quite a bit of wiping to wipe that rail liner. And had the engine I used to wipe and clean things up. That was my midnight shift. That's where I started.
Were they still steam, or were they?
Oh yeah, they were steam. They were steam when I first started in '51, but they were making conversions over to oil in them days even. They had a few oil burners then, burning bunker C fuel. So they'd bring in yes, in the early 50s, the CNR started to switch to oil. And they used to bring in a tank of this bunker C fuel oil into the roundhouse. It would originally come from Lloydminster, I believe. They'd bring it down by carloads. And they'd bring this tank in and have it sitting in one of the 15 stalls that they had in the roundhouse. And they'd have to have the yard engine sitting alongside on either side with the steam line from the yard engine over to the bunker C tank. They'd have to keep that tank warm all the time. The bunker C was heavy oil. They'd have to keep it warm so it would flow easy. So that's how they used to keep that bunker C fuel warm all the time. And on the other side, on the opposite side, they had the track open, so a steam engine that was converted to oil could come in, and they could fill the tank, oil tank, with bunker C fuel. They'd have a little pump, and they'd just pump it from the bunker C to the other one. It used to work real good. Of course, when I first got there was just a few engines converted, and it used to cost them quite a bit. They used to send them down to Winnipeg they would convert them from coal tender to a bunker C tender, and then they'd bring them up and they'd start using them on the line between here and Vermilion. It was a great experience in them days with the bunker sea fuel. To get a good fire going in that steamer there, they'd just turn a valve and away she'd go.
Is North Battleford a busy train station back in the 50s?
Oh, all through the 50s there, North Battleford had a roundhouse with 15 stalls. And especially in the fall, they used to get more than 15 engines in around. And all the stalls in the roundhouse would be full, and they used to have 2 or 3 engines outside. They couldn't put them in the roundhouse, so that in the summertime it was okay. They could service them outside to keep them going, and it wasn't too much trouble. In fact, it was nice to get outside and do them. But they were very busy. They used everything by train in them days, steam engine. They had a line running from North Battleford to Vermilion. They had this line running to Wahlberg. They had a line running through Medstead, Spiritwood, to PA. North Battleford was quite a center, a railroad center. A lot of people don't know it, but North Battleford was chosen for the simple reason because North Battleford is halfway between Regina and Edmonton. So the passenger trains that run from Regina to Edmonton used to stop here in North Battleford because North Battleford was a terminal for the CNR in them days. That's why they had a roundhouse with 15 stalls to keep these engines in.
So you worked with the railroad from 1951 till 61. And why did you leave the railway in 1961?
Well, that's a real good question. See, when the railroad converted from steam to oil, and then from oil to diesel, they needed a lot less maintenance for these diesels. In fact, they don't even have to put them in the roundhouse anymore. So when in '61 they brought the diesels into North Battleford, and thereby making these steam engines obsolete. So at one time in the 50s, when I was working on the railroad, they had about 130,000 people across Canada working for the railroad. After they converted from steam to diesel, they needed less men.
It would be from bunker C fuel to diesel.
Yes, right. From bunker C. A lot of them engines were only run about 5 years on oil, and then they were obsolete. So they needed less men. But they laid the boilermen off, the boilermen's helpers. They laid machinists off. They laid machinist helpers off.
The jobs are just superfluous now.
Jobs just disappeared right and left. Yeah. So I got a job at Battleford Union Hospital in the boiler room in '61, and I worked there for 17 years until my retirement in 1977.
So you would say that had a pretty good life living in North Battleford. You've had a few different jobs.
Oh yes, it was quite exciting for me in a way. When I look back now, I think people in my age group, they're kind of fortunate in a way. They have had the experience like that with improvements in mechanization coming on now, and with the computer and everything coming out the way it is, we really don't know how things are going to go in the next few years.
And this week you'll be 73 years old.
Yeah, next Sunday. I'll be 73, born June the 30th, 1912. So we'll have to celebrate a little, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mott.